The Threnex Imperial Court Station did not have mornings. It had cycles, 26-hour rotations governed by a central chronometer that pulsed a soft violet light through every corridor, a color the Threnex considered soothing. Amara Osei-Lindqvist had never found it soothing. She found it clinical, the way a hospital light is clinical, the way a countdown clock is clinical. She had been awake for 11 minutes before the light changed, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her assigned quarters, 4 meters by 3, the smallest habitable module on the diplomatic ring, reserved for the lowest-ranked delegation in the entire court. Tier 9, unaligned primitive. The placard outside her door in Threnex script and a begrudging human-readable subtitle still read Earth, provisional, even after 6 years of her presence. She liked the floor. It reminded her of the concrete stairwells of New Lagos Orbital, where she'd spent her adolescence between deployments, her mother explaining trade law over reheated jollof rice while distant thrusters shook dust from the ceiling panels. She missed dust. The Threnex stations were immaculate in a way that felt less like cleanliness and more like erasure. On the small fold-down desk in front of her sat a stack of files, not holographic, not digital, but actual printed paper, smuggled in over years through diplomatic pouches that the Threnex customs officers scanned and dismissed as primitive record-keeping, charming. The top file bore a name in her own handwriting, Boateng, K, Case 0417. She did not open it. She never opened it in the morning. She opened it at night, when the station's second shift went quiet, and the corridor stopped smelling of ozone and started smelling of nothing at all, which was somehow worse. Instead, she stood, straightened the gray wool of her diplomatic jacket, real wool, earth-made, itchy and warm and utterly unlike the frictionless polymer weave every other species in the court wore, and clipped an old analog wristwatch to her sleeve, where a sensor cuff would normally go. It was her grandfather's watch. It did not sync to anything. It did not report her biometrics to Threnex court security, which was, in its own quiet way, an act of treason under 3 separate Dominion statutes she had memorized and chosen to ignore. Her hand trembled as she fastened the clasp. Just a flicker, a half-second tremor in the left hand, an old inheritance from a night 11 years ago she did not let herself think about before the day had properly begun. She pressed her palm flat against the desk until it stopped, the way she always did, the way she'd trained herself to do until it became as automatic as breathing. Then Amara Osei-Lindqvist opened her door and stepped into a day that would end with an empire in the dark. The Grand Concordance Hall of the Threnex Imperial Court was built to make visitors feel small, and it succeeded magnificently. Ceilings that vanished into engineered mist, walls of living crystal that shifted color to reflect the emotional consensus of the room, which today read a self-satisfied gold. 17 delegations stood arranged by tier, the towering chitinous Vile Corps at Tier 2, their honor guard bristling with weapons Earth had no name for. The fluid, luminous Usanth Collective at Tier 4, murmuring in light language. And so on, down and down, until at the very back, behind a velvet rope that no other delegation had to stand behind, stood Amara. Alone. Tier 9's entire permitted representation. She had gotten used to being furniture. At the center of the hall, on a dais of black stone quarried from a moon the Threnex had annexed 3 centuries prior, sat the Emperor. His name, in the clicking layered syllables of High Threnex, was unpronounceable by human vocal cords, so the Corps simply called him what his own subjects did in casual speech, Vorhassk. He was old even by Threnex standards, his carapace gone the color of tarnished bronze, his 6 eyes, arranged in 2 vertical rows of 3, each tracking a different quadrant of the room simultaneously, a biological feature that made Threnex nobility very difficult to lie to and very easy for them to feel infallible. Today Vorhassk was amused. "Bring forward," he said, his translator voice a flat, synthetic baritone that stripped all warmth from his words and replaced it with something colder. The Tier 9 envoy's final warning. A ripple of sound moved through the hall, Threnex laughter which manifested as a rhythmic clicking of mandibles, a sound like dry branches breaking. Amara did not laugh. She stepped forward, past the velvet rope, alone, and unrolled a physical scroll, Paper again, deliberately, a symbol as much as a document, bearing the seal of the Earth Diplomatic Corps and the full formal text of Treaty Annex 14th Gamma. The Dominion's binding, centuries-old commitment to cease unauthorized fleet movement into any signatory species' sovereign colonial space. Emperor Vorhassk, she said, and her voice did not shake, though the paper in her right hand, not her left, never let it be the left, trembled almost imperceptibly. The Earth Diplomatic Corps formally notifies the Threnex Dominion that unauthorized fleet elements have entered the new Lagos colonial perimeter in violation of Annex 14 Gamma, Section 3. Per treaty stipulation, Earth issues its final warning. Withdrawal is required within the treaty-mandated compliance window, or automatic remedy provisions will engage. Silence. Then the clicking laughter again, louder now, a whole hall of mandibles snapping in genuine, delighted disbelief. Automatic remedy provisions, Vorhassk repeated, savoring the words like a delicacy. Tell me, attaché, what remedy does a Tier 9 species propose? Strongly worded correspondence? A sternly written letter? His 6 eyes crinkled, the Threnex equivalent of a grin. Your colonies exist because we have not yet decided they are worth the fuel to erase. Do not mistake our patience for parity. Amara let the laughter finish. She had learned over 6 years that silence was the only weapon Tier 9 was permitted to hold, and she wielded it now with the precision of a surgeon. The Emperor is, of course, correct that Earth possesses no fleet capable of contesting Dominion forces, she said evenly. Earth does not intend to. The treaty does not require it. Annex 14 Gamma's remedy provisions were drafted by the Dominion itself 3 centuries ago, under Emperor Vashran II, and ratified without amendment. I would direct the Emperor's attention to Section 9, Subclause C. For the first time, something flickered behind Vorhassk's 6 eyes that was not amusement. Which no one, he said slowly, has ever invoked. No one has ever needed to, Amara said. Until today. The Emperor waved a clawed hand, dismissive, already turning to the next matter of court business, already forgetting her, exactly as she needed him to. Strike the warning from record as noted and ignored. Send the occupation fleet to New Lagos at once, a symbolic gesture, nothing more. Let the primitives see what a real final warning looks like. The hall erupted into that dry, clicking laughter one final time. Amara Osei-Lindqvist bowed, precisely the correct depth for a Tier 9 envoy addressing a Dominion emperor. No more, no less, a bow that was itself a small act of defiance, exact to the centimeter, refusing to grovel a fraction lower than protocol demanded, and withdrew from the hall. She was 3 corridors away, alone, when her earpiece chimed with an encrypted transmission on a frequency that had not been used since Kwame Boateng was alive. She stopped walking. The message was 11 words long, appended with a live countdown timestamp that had already begun ticking downward from a number that made her blood run cold. Treaty Default Protocol armed. Compliance window, 9. Awaiting field activation, 9 minutes. Somewhere, deep in the archives of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, a failsafe clause buried in a 300-year-old treaty had just been triggered by the Emperor's own refusal to withdraw, and it was now Amara's job, and Amara's job alone, to make sure it did not simply expire unfulfilled into another century of being laughed at. Her left hand began to tremble. She pressed it flat against the corridor wall, the metal cold and unfamiliar under her palm, and for 1/2 second she was not on a Threnex station at all. She was in a windowless room on Ceres Station, 11 years younger, watching a hostage negotiation collapse in real time because she had hesitated exactly 4 seconds too long, believing, the way she had been trained to believe, that protocol would hold. It hadn't. Kwame Boateng had died with his hands raised, following the very rules he'd spent 30 years teaching her to trust. Amara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and the tremor stopped, and she began very calmly to walk toward the maintenance ring. She would not hesitate again. The countdown lived now in 2 places, encrypted on her earpiece ticking downward in cold blue digits, and on the analog wristwatch on her sleeve, which she had set, the moment she received the signal, to count backward from 9 minutes using nothing but the second hand and her own memory. Digital systems could be jammed, spoofed, or simply switched off by a Threnex security officer with the right clearance. A hand wound mechanism built by a Swiss craftsman 2 centuries ago could not. She had 8 minutes and 40 seconds remaining, and she needed to be 4 decks down, inside a section of the station that officially did not exist on any Threnex operational schematic still in active use, because the Threnex had stopped updating those schematics 140 years ago, when they annexed the industrial world of Corvex Elan and inherited its infrastructure wholesale, then promptly forgot it was there. The court station's entire atmospheric gravity power nexus, the beating mechanical heart that kept 40,000 Threnex citizens breathing, walking upright under artificial gravity, and drawing power for every light, weapon, and life support node on the capital's crown jewel, ran on legacy Corvex Elan industrial architecture, bulky, analog compatible, built by a species that had understood, the way humans understood, that machines eventually fail and someone has to be able to fix them with their hands. The Threnex considered infrastructure beneath the attention of a ruling species. They had energy shields that could deflect a moon. They saw no reason to modernize the pipes. And buried in the original annexation treaty, the very treaty whose remedy clause now ticked toward 0 in Amara's ear, was a clause the Threnex had never bothered to strike. The diplomatic maintenance clause, a relic of an era when the Dominion had needed to reassure conquered infrastructure workers that embassy staff from allied worlds could perform emergency repairs on shared systems without triggering a security incident. No one had invoked it in a century. No one had thought to remove it, because no one still believed a Tier 9 diplomat could read a Corvex Elan schematic well enough to matter. Amara had spent 4 years reading them, quietly. At night, after Boateng's files, by the light of a desk lamp she was fairly sure violated at least one Threnex energy conservation ordinance. She reached the access checkpoint at 8:12 remaining. A Threnex security drone, squat, 6-legged, unbothered, rotated its optical cluster toward her. "Attaché," it said, in the same flat translator baritone as every automated system on the station. "This corridor is restricted to certified maintenance personnel." Amara produced her identification chip and pressed it to the drone's reader. Diplomatic Maintenance Clause, Treaty of Corvex Elan Annexation, Article 6. Embassy technical staff retain standing access to shared infrastructure nodes for the purpose of emergency system integrity checks. I am invoking that clause now. A pause. The drone's optical cluster flickered. Not malice, just confusion. The mechanical equivalent of a raised eyebrow. That clause has not been invoked in 106 years. Its expiration was never written into the statute, Amara said. Check the language yourself if you'd like. I'll wait. She would not wait. She had 7 minutes and 50 seconds. But she said it with such flat procedural certainty, the voice of someone who has never once lied about a citation in her life, because she never needed to, that the drone's threat assessment subroutines, built by an empire that genuinely believed Tier 9 species were incapable of the patience required for deception, simply deferred. Access granted, the drone said. Do not exceed authorized maintenance parameters. The door hissed open onto a service corridor that smelled of hot metal and recycled air, lit by intermittent amber strips instead of the court's ambient violet. Amara stepped through, and the door sealed behind her with a sound like a held breath finally released. 7 minutes, 31 seconds. The first obstacle was a security lock on the primary junction hatch. A modern Threnex overlay bolted awkwardly onto the old Corvex Elan frame, biometric, keyed to Threnex physiology, 6-fingered claw prints and thermal signatures that no human hand could replicate. Amara knelt in front of it and pulled 2 objects from the inner lining of her jacket, sewn there years ago by her own hand, in violation of at least 4 separate customs regulations. A battered multi-tool, its handle worn smooth from 2 decades of use, and her core-issued translator device, small and unremarkable, the same model every human diplomat in the court carried without a second thought. The Threnex had scanned her translator 1,000 times. It had never once occurred to their customs officials to check what else it could do, because a translator was, to them, a single-purpose instrument. the same way a hammer was a single-purpose instrument to a species that had never needed to improvise. Amara popped the translator's rear casing with the multi-tool's smallest blade, exposing a tangle of components never intended to be seen, and rerouted its short-range signal processor to feed a looping, garbled thermal and biometric ghost signature into the lock's sensor array. Not a hack, not in the way the Threnex would recognize a hack, but a crude analog trick as old as human engineering itself. Feed the sensor exactly the kind of noisy, ambiguous nonsense data it was designed to politely ignore, and let its own error tolerance do the rest. The lock, built by a species that had never imagined a Tier 9 diplomat would understand its logic well enough to lie to it, blinked green. The hatch opened onto a vertical maintenance shaft, and below it, humming with the low mechanical heartbeat of a 140-year-old industrial system still faithfully doing its job, lay the AGP Nexus. 6 minutes, 4 seconds. Amara began to climb down. The Nexus was enormous. A cathedral of pipe and conduit and pressure regulation machinery stretching in every direction, lit by the same tired amber strips, its architecture unmistakably, almost nostalgically industrial. Catwalks of riveted metal. Analog pressure gauges with actual needles. Junction boxes labeled in a dead species alphabet that some long-forgotten Corvex Elon engineer had thoughtfully cross-referenced, decades ago, into a standardized technical shorthand that, by pure historical accident, mapped almost cleanly onto the modular industrial notation Earth engineers had been using for over a century. It was, Amara thought, climbing down the last rungs of the access ladder, the first place on this entire station that had ever felt like home. She reached the primary distribution floor with 5 minutes, 40 seconds remaining, and got to work. The plan was not to destroy anything. Destruction would be an act of war, and an act of war would hand Vorhassk exactly the justification his generals were no doubt already drafting. The plan, Earth's plan, 3 centuries in the making, buried in treaty language no one had bothered to update, was smaller, stranger, and infinitely harder to fight. Force, a lawful default. Make the court's own systems shut themselves down, floor by floor, not from sabotage, but from the automatic compliance mechanisms the Dominion itself had written into its own founding law and never repealed. She began venting non-lethal pressure differentials in the secondary atmospheric loop, not enough to endanger a single Threnex life, but enough to trip the court's environmental alarms and force an emergency session of the ruling council, who by treaty statute were required to convene in person in the Concordance Hall within 4 minutes of any Nexus-level environmental fault. She needed Vorhassk in that hall. She needed witnesses. 4 minutes, 50 seconds. She wrapped a length of insulated wiring tape, pulled from the small emergency kit every diplomatic staffer carried, the kind of mundane object no customs officer on any world had ever thought worth confiscating, around a corroded gravity plating relay junction, binding 2 conduits that had drifted a ½ centimeter apart over a century of use, close enough now to arc a controlled current between them. The station's gravity plating on decks 12 through 16 flickered, dropped by 11% and stabilized. Enough to make every Threnex on those decks stumble, enough to make the emergency systems scream, not enough to hurt anyone. 4 minutes, 6 seconds. Somewhere above her, Threnex communication channels she could hear faintly through the Nexus's ambient relay speakers, a maintenance-era holdover no one had thought to strip out, began to fill with rising, static-edged panic. Multiple faults, deck 12 through 16, gravity and atmospheric. This isn't a malfunction pattern. Someone is doing this manually. Locate the source. Cross-reference every ID that entered a restricted corridor in the last hour. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. Amara moved along the catwalk to the non-essential power distribution array and began, methodically, disabling one node after another. Not the life support, never the life support, but the decorative lighting, the ornamental crystal wall emotion displays, the ceremonial fountains in the hall's antechamber. Small, symbolic, escalating losses that would be impossible for the court to ignore and impossible for its engineers to quietly patch, because every node she touched was wired by a century-old design choice she had studied for 4 years into the same aging trunk line. Reroute power from Sector 9, Sector 9 is already down. It's cascading faster than we can compensate. 2 minutes, 51 seconds. A Threnex data analyst officer's voice cut through the chaos, sharper than the rest, edged with something close to real fear. Our threat models never accounted for this, the voice said, and Amara, crouched beside a junction box with wiring tape between her teeth, allowed herself one small, grim smile at the sound of it. Every predictive framework we have assumes an aggressor wants speed. This, whatever this is patient. It's methodical. It's not trying to win quickly. I don't think it's trying to win at all. I think it's trying to make us stop. Not classified correctly, Amara thought. 6 years too late, but you got there. 2 minutes, 20 seconds. She reached the final junction. The master relay that would, if she completed the sequence, trigger the treaty's dormant automatic remedy protocol across the entire AGP nexus at once, exactly as Vashran II had written it 3 centuries ago. A lawful, bloodless total seizure of infrastructure control activated the instant a Tier 9 signatory formally certified non-compliance with a final warning inside the compliance window. She reached for the manual activation lever, and that was when the maintenance corridor behind her filled with the harsh white beam of Threnex security floodlights, and a voice, not panicked now, but cold, certain, and entirely unamused, said, "Attaché Osei-Lindqvist, step away from the relay. You are under arrest for infrastructure sabotage against the Threnex Dominion." Amara turned, slowly, hands raised, not in surrender but in the exact, deliberate motion of someone showing a room full of armed people that her hands held no weapon, because the truth of what she held was worse than any weapon they could have imagined. A treaty clause and a stopwatch. 6 Threnex security officers filled the corridor behind her, energy rifles leveled, their carapaces catching the amber light in sharp, hard angles. At their front stood an officer whose insignia marked him as Court Security Command, the same cold voice from the corridor. Amara Osei-Lindqvist stood in the near dark, blood on her sleeve, both hands finally mercifully still, and watched the second hand of her grandfather's wristwatch tick past 0. 9 minutes. Somewhere far above her, in the Grand Concordance Hall, 40,000 citizens' worth of light, gravity, and power failed at once, and Emperor Vorhassk's mocking laughter died in his throat. The Grand Concordance Hall, when Amara finally climbed back up through the access shaft and walked its length for the second time that day, was unrecognizable. The living crystal walls, deprived of power, had gone dull and gray, no longer reflecting any emotional consensus at all. An accidental honesty the Threnex nobility had clearly never intended their own architecture to display. The engineered mist had dissipated from the ceiling, revealing for the first time in 3 centuries of court history that the vast dome above the throne was simply bare metal, unremarkable, industrial. The same bones every station in the galaxy was built on, whether its owners wanted to admit it or not. Emergency lighting cast the entire hall in the same tired amber as the nexus below. 17 delegations stood in the dark, murmuring, their translators glitching in and out on backup power, their honor guards' weapons dead in their hands. The Vial Corps' bristling arsenal, the Osinth Collective's shifting light language, all of it silenced, all of it, for the first time in living memory, genuinely equal to everyone else in the room. Vorhassk sat rigid on his black stone dais, his 6 eyes no longer tracking 6 quadrants of confident authority, but fixed, all of them, on the single figure walking the length of the darkened hall toward him. Amara's uniform was scorched at the shoulder, her sleeve stained dark with drying blood, her left hand trembling openly now, visibly, for the first time in 11 years, in front of an audience that had once read that same tremor as fear, and had this time no idea what to call it at all. She stopped at the base of the dais and did not bow. "Emperor Vorhassk," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried through a hall gone utterly silent. "The Threnex Dominion is in formal verified default of Treaty Annex 14 Gamma, as certified under the automatic remedy provisions of Article 9, Subclause C. Per that treaty's binding terms, the terms your own empire wrote and ratified 3 centuries ago, administrative control of this station's atmospheric gravity power nexus has passed, lawfully and without contest, into the custody of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, pending formal renegotiation of colonial boundary terms. A ripple moved through the darkened hall. Not laughter this time. Something closer to disbelief, and beneath it unmistakably the first tremor of fear. No lives were lost, Amara continued, her voice never rising, never breaking. No weapon was fired. No shot was returned. This was not an act of war, Emperor. It was an act of law, your law, held to its word, by the only signatory in this hall, who apparently still remembered it was binding. Vorhask's mandibles clicked once, a sound with none of its earlier amusement in it. You would humiliate an empire, he said, over a colonial dispute. I would remind an empire, Amara said, that it laughed at a final warning 9 minutes ago, and that the species it laughed at is now the only reason this court station has power scheduled to return within the hour, rather than remaining dark until your own engineers, who have not opened a Corvex-Elan schematic in 140 years, relearn how to read one. She let that settle into the silence. Effective immediately, she said. The Earth Diplomatic Corps formally petitions this court, under the precedent established today, for Earth's reclassification from Tier 9 unaligned primitive to Tier 6 recognized sovereign, a classification, I would note, that requires no vote of this assembly, as the Concord Classification Accord itself stipulates that any species capable of unilaterally enforcing a binding treaty, default against the presiding power, qualifies automatically for reclassification review. Section 2, Subclause A. Your own framework, Emperor. I did not write it, I only read it. Somewhere in the dark, a Threnex data analyst officer, the same one whose voice had cracked with realization in the nexus below, now standing among the ministerial staff at the edge of the dais, spoke quietly, almost to himself, but not quietly enough. Our models never accounted for a species that could outweight us. No one contradicted him. Vorhassk sat very still on his dark throne, his 6 eyes for the first time since Amara had entered his court 6 years ago, finding nothing amused, nothing dismissive, and nothing small to say. Reclassification review, he said at last, will be considered. It will be granted, Amara said, or Earth will simply let this station discover exactly how many other dormant clauses lie unread in 3 centuries of treaties this Dominion never expected anyone to actually enforce. She turned then without waiting for a response because there was nothing left for the Emperor to say that would change what had already happened, and because 6 years of being furniture had taught her precisely how much weight a well-timed silence could carry. She walked the length of the darkened hall alone, past 17 delegations who, for the first time in the history of the Threnex court, did not know where to rank her. At the threshold she stopped. She did not turn around. She did not raise her voice. She simply reached up with her right hand and touched the old wristwatch on her sleeve. Stopped now, its work done, its second hand resting exactly where it needed to be, and said the name she had not spoken aloud in 11 years. Quietly, to no one, to everyone, to the memory of a mentor who had taught her that protocol, held long enough and trusted completely enough, could still, in the end, be the sharpest weapon in the room. Kwame. Then Amara Osei-Lindqvist walked out of the Grand Concordance Hall, into the dim amber light of a capital that would remember her name for the next 3 centuries, and did not look back. End.